Welcome, everybody. I am Ananya. I'm a reporter at Rest of World. Thank you for joining today's event. We're diving into one of the most hyped and debated frontiers in tech right now, humanoid robots. This exciting conversation will be hosted by my colleague in Taipei, Taiwan, Kinling Lo. Kinling recently wrote a story about China accounting for nearly all global humanoid robot sales. I urge you to go give that a read, maybe after this conversation. Today, she's joined by consultancy firm Omdia's chief tech analyst, Lian Jye Su. I'm sorry if I butchered that. And he's the author of the latest humanoid robot report that Omdia recently put out. The two of them will together break down what those numbers actually mean, what is hype and what's not, and what benchmarks actually matter when you're talking about judging the progress in humanoid robots. A few of the quick housekeeping tips right before we begin are that the session is being recorded, so if you prefer not to appear on camera, please free to turn off your videos. We'll start with about 20 minutes of conversation and then move into a Q&A. Some of the questions have already come in. Thank you to the people who sent them in on the Google Forms. And then some of them we'll pick up from the chat box. So if you could please drop your name, designation, and whatever question you might have, we'll try to take as many of them as we can. And I'll put this information in the chat as well, so you know what follow. And now I'll hand it over to Kinling. Kinling, please go ahead.
Thanks, Ananya. Hi, everybody. So thank you so much for taking the time to join us today. I'm Kinling, and I'm based in Taipei, as Ananya said. I'm really delighted to be hosting this conversation with our guest, Lian Jye Su. So Lian Jye is a chief analyst at Omdia, a technology research and advisory group. He advises clients across the technology ecosystem, and he's based in Singapore. I've personally interviewed Lian Jye a few times, and he is one of the most well-informed tech analysts that I know. And so, especially when it comes to AI and robotics as well. So there have been so many headline stories in the humanoid robot space recently, and some of those headlines we picked up at Rest of World. This therefore feels like the exact right moment to take a step back, examine what those numbers and claims actually tell us, what might be the hype, and where this industry actually stands right now. Lian Jye, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah, so I'd like to start with something that people who might have paid attention to humanoid robots might have seen just last week. So some Chinese robotics companies have used a national television event during Lunar New Year to showcase some of the latest moves of their humanoid robots. So we've seen them performing choreographed dances, increasingly complex moves, including, of course, very sophisticated backflips and kung fu. And we've seen that last year, but this year they appeared a lot more sophisticated than before.
Yeah.
So I want to know that as viewers, how should we interpret these viral moments on TV and YouTube when assessing the real progress of the humanoid robotics industry?
Yeah, so obviously, as you said, the Spring Festival Gala robotic demonstration was a big success in terms of, let's say, garnering sort of attention from the public. I think what the robotics vendor has successfully done during the performance is to showcase what the current states of the robots are, the capability of the robots when it comes to their fluidity, their flexibility, their adaptability when it comes to complex movements and sort of a precise motion. Obviously, some of, or even let's say all of those can be carried forward into actual enterprise use cases. So sort of when we think about deploying robots in a very structured environment to carrying out fixed or sort of scheduled tasks, I'm pretty sure with the current dexterity the robot demonstrates, we will be able to perform the task in a very accurate and precise manner. I think the other part to the entire conversation is the fact that China has been able to demonstrate itself as the leading market when it comes to embodied intelligence in general. So sort of being able to produce this robot at scale, being able to coordinate all these robotics movements in a very obviously coordinated manner, in a very structured way, and to obviously allow them to perform very complex tasks. I think that in itself showcase the capability of the wider ecosystem, not just from the hardware, but all the way to the software, to the components, and then also all the way to the cloud stack of the technology. I think from from a broader, let's say, value chain or supply chain standpoint, we are seeing China as a very viable market for humanoid robotics, and that paints a very exciting future for the country and for the wider tech industry.
Yeah, and behind like these exciting moves we see demonstrating in videos, let's break it down to like facts and figures, because we know that there are a lot of reports on how many robots that these humanoid companies actually, are able to deliver. And in the story that I wrote last month, which I interviewed you for, we talked about, how there 90% of humanoid robots that were shipped last year actually came from Chinese companies. Why are there so many more Chinese companies producing humanoids compared to the US or anywhere else?
So I think the first reason boils down to the fact that China has been growing its, let's say, high-end engineering manufacturing capability at a steady pace in the past decades. So sort of ever since the various policies being announced by the Chinese government with regards to industrial manufacturing. So think of Made in China 2025 and sort of the 14th five-year plan that focuses a lot on strengthening the industrial manufacturing capability. I think we are now sort of seeing the fruits of those policies, and that kind of carries itself into not just obviously in robotics, but also to the wider manufacturing capabilities when it comes to electronic vehicles, for example, EVs, when it comes to sort of the solar panel industry, to the aviation industry. So sort of the strengthening and the improvement of the overall industrial manufacturing sector, and then coupled with a lot of the investment that the Chinese has encouraged when it comes to the software side of things. So if you think of the AI capability, all the way from the foundation model development to the actual AI chipset that can now be manufactured and sort of shipped in China. I think the combination of both factors drives a lot of the current scale in producing humanoid robots. I think there is a third force at play here, which is the demand that we are actually seeing from a lot of the state-owned Chinese enterprises when it comes to adoption of all these robots. That is, in many cases, probably absent in other markets. I think that helps to, in many ways, act as a catalyst and propel the production and the adoption of humanoid robots in China.
All right. I think you already addressed some of the answer that I would want to ask in the follow-up. I wanted to ask, like, who is buying these Chinese robots? You mentioned state players, but there are like thousands and tens of thousands of these robots being shipped last year. So who else is buying them?
Yeah, so obviously the main adopters are the sort of like the large state-owned enterprises. I think one of the most discussed one was the very large order that came from China Mobile, which is China's largest telecommunication service provider. Well, for a very interesting use case, most of the humanoid robots being deployed by China Mobile is for their customer service department. So they obviously, China Mobile has plenty of sort of customer-facing branches across China that are either in retail stores or in sort of brick and mortar type of premises, and they are generally being manned by humans at the moment. But now the hope is that with a lot more robots that can, let's say, augment a lot of the existing employees with robotics employees or robotics co-workers in this case. And the robotic co-workers obviously can do a lot of the greetings and the sort of the more repetitive, let's say, explanation tasks that previously been carried out by the human employees. Now, this is obviously a very unique use cases that I would say probably applies a lot more to, let's say, the telco industry that has traditionally been that has a very big retail footprint. I think most of the use cases that we are now seeing are kind of being divided into two camps. So the first one is being focused a lot more on the research and development, as well as sort of the more performative side of things. So basically, think of obviously, if you go to China right now, in fact, you will see a lot of robots being deployed in various shopping malls or retail locations to do sort of performative actions, or sort of dances, or sort of opera performances. And many of them are also being deployed by, let's say, high education institution to either for coding or for education purposes. So these are sort of I will categorize as sort of more consumer facing use cases. So basically, performing tasks that are not as stringent or as sort of precise in terms of requirement, but sort of obviously are more generalized, and sort of are then required to sort of let's say serve the more let's say consumer facing demands. There is another type of deployments that is a lot more focused on the enterprise side of things, which is a lot more manufacturing focused, and that with that, we are seeing particularly a lot of the automotive manufacturers adopting all these robots to perform, let's say, quality controls and quality inspection, to carry out material handling on the factory floors. Now, the number of deployment in that domain remains, I think, on the lower side of things. It will take time for the robots to be really good at replacing a true human worker on a factory floor. But that is because we, I think, now sit at the very early stage of humanoid robotics technology, despite the fact that, as we mentioned earlier on, all the interesting demos that we see at the Spring Festival Gala, there is a certain gap that I think the industry is still trying to resolve, and that will take some time. But I do believe that in the long run, we will eventually address those challenges.
So it's very interesting that you mentioned many of the Chinese humanoid robots are actually for consumer-facing or customer service purposes right now, because that certainly doesn't seem to me is the case for U.S. companies that are making humanoid robots. So on the U.S. side, one of the most high-profile humanoid robot effort is made by Tesla. So Tesla's Optimus robots, now they're saying that they're aiming to have it launched in public by 2027. And I want to know if this is a realistic roadmap from your point of view.
So I think there is two ways to look at it. I think Tesla has always been a champion of humanoid robots and has been a pioneer, in fact, when it comes to the, let's say, one of the earlier demos that came out from a private company. I think obviously we all remember what Boston Dynamics has done with humanoid robotic technology, but I mean, we could at this point probably argue that there is a very early prototype or very early vision of what the technology can deliver. I think Tesla has managed to produce sort of the first prototype that kind of make sense, in the sense that it's very close to what we have at the moment. And obviously Optimus has went through multiple iterations, and at this point has sort of I would say almost state-of-the-art technology when it comes to its movement, its dexterity, its fluidity. So in that sense, it's not let's say it's actually very probable that the Optimus will be made publicly available next year. The question is, how big is that deployment size is going to be? There is obviously, if you base on what Tesla wanted to do, it appears that the company does want to sort of eat its own dog food in a way. So the idea is to deploy as many Optimus as possible on sort of Tesla already very highly automated manufacturing line, and sort of being able to, let's say, maximize the return of investment that they make in humanoid robots, and that creates this positive cycle when it comes to all the capacity investment that they make across the board. Because ultimately, Optimus uses almost the same type of components that goes into Tesla EVs and are using the company's own AI chipset as well. So it's kind of a continuation of what Tesla has been doing for the past decades when it comes to their investment in automotive. I think the challenge now, as I mentioned earlier, is with scale, and scale right now, I think, tilts more towards China's advantage just because of the just broader manufacturing base. And I think in the US, there is also, I think, what we are seeing, let's say, not say completely lack of demand, but definitely a more sort of muted responses from the manufacturers. And that's also partially because most of the manufacturing bases are in Asia and not in the US. So probably we will see a slower adoption rate in the US. But that by no means is, let's say, a bad thing for Tesla, or in fact for any other US humanoid robotic startup, because it will take time for them to build up their production base. And by the time they build it up, I think they will be ready for large scale deployment.
All right. And before I move on to my next question, I would like to remind the audience that you can now file questions for Lian Jye in the Google Meet chat box, and we will take your questions very soon. So right now we were talking about like the difference between how Tesla makes their robots and why they're not scaling up as fast as the Chinese companies probably have. And so I want to ask, like, what should be the benchmark that we use to assess how advanced a humanoid robot company is? If that's the case, if a company can scale, but their models doesn't mean that they're the most advanced in the industry, how should we look at this?
Yeah, so there are a few, let's say, parameters that analyst firms like us uses when we try to assess the maturity of a humanoid robotics company. If you look at what goes into a humanoid robot, it requires really, really good hardware, really good software. It requires the company to have production capability and the scale of production as well. The company also kind of needs to have the right investment when it comes to their development team, be it software or hardware, and sort of ideally also want to have strong partnership on the commercial side of things, particularly nowadays when we look at the wider market landscape where most of the humanoid robotics companies are still in a startup phase. To do international rollout can be quite challenging. So in many cases, all these companies will at some point require either a system integrator or a reseller in other markets that helps them with expanding their global footprint. And at some point, they will probably also need sort of support, sort of on the ground support from vendors in other markets to help them with installation, with deployment, with debugging, with maintenance. So sort of it does require sort of like a multifaceted criteria to assess the maturity of a humanoid robotics company. And I would say at this point, what we are seeing is that obviously the Chinese vendors are a lot more advanced when it comes to the production scales, but the US company are actually very, very strong when it comes to the technical side of things, especially in the hardware and software department.
So you've pointed out to us that there might just be two different playbooks played by Chinese humanoid robot companies and the US ones. And so maybe we can round up this part by asking you the final question, which is like, so do you think there is a bubble forming among Chinese humanoid robot companies? And is there a lag in the US which would make them, actually really fall behind when the stage develops to scaling of robots one day?
I think at this point, the market is sort of still somewhat rational enough when it comes to the production and shipment of all these robots. The market does need a lot more robots for many reasons. I think the most important one is because in general, the market doesn't have enough let's say existing or publicly available data set to train or fine-tune these robots on. Fundamentally, we are able to, let's say, experience really good technology on the AI side of things because of a lot of the public data that we have, let's say in open source data sets or sort of public forums like Wikipedia and Reddit. We just don't have that in the robotics domain, or rather in the I generally don't like this word, but then in the physical AI domain, because all this interaction that we do in the physical world and the very complex scenes and environment that we have to deal with in the real world means that we do need to collect as much data as possible before we can fully, let's say, trust a robotic system to be general enough to be deployed across multiple use cases. So sort of having all these robots being deployed out there means that the robotics vendor especially will be able to collect the right and the best data that they can have, that they can take on, and that will help them massively in building out, better future robots and better iteration of their AI technology moving forward. Now, you probably argue that, well, in that case, perhaps maybe that is a loss-making business. But if you think of how AI started in the early days, actually right before ChatGPT, it was also a capital-intensive business, and we were still talking about ROI even at this point. So sort of, I think it will take some time for the market to quote unquote correct itself, or sort of being able to present to the investor a more positive ROI. But I think this step is kind of necessary before we reach that stage.
Right. Thank you so much. And we've already received a few questions from our audience. And so I'll ask them for you. I will ask you for them. So there's Ricardo wants to ask what you think about Yann LeCun's criticism of LLMs, and what is your view about the current development of VLAs? So I will break down these buzzwords for our audience. So a VLA is a vision language action model, which is the kind of model used in robot learning, and they're built upon large language models, which is the models that, as regular users, we rely on today when we use AI. So Yann LeCun is Meta's former chief AI scientist, and he argues that this approach of training robots using LLMs it's not the way to go. It cannot achieve the kind of artificial intelligence that we need to train good robots. Lian Jye, do you have anything to say about that?
Yeah, so obviously I would say, this is obviously way more smarter than me. So obviously he's on to some point. But I think I would kind of answer this from a market standpoint. I think from a technology standpoint, I would say what Yan's mentioned is definitely spot on. Like, if you really want to make or create great robots, VLA has its limits, and there is let's say a ceiling that you can reach with that technology. But I'll break it down from why is that still the popular approach from a market standpoint. Because if you look at the technology that's available to the robotics developer nowadays, VLA is still the most viable approach that a developer can use, and it's reasonably smart enough for a developer to create smart enough robots. If you look at going back to the same example again, like all the robots being deployed at Spring Festival Gala, they all in one way or the other uses VLA, and to be able to reach this stage using VLA kind of tells you that this technology has its benefit and has its I would say reason to exist in the robotics industry. Now, whether or not that takes us to the next step is where the industry kind of, let's say, have a very different view. From Yan's standpoint, I think he argues that the next step should be war models. So obviously him and a bunch of other very, very smart AI scientists, like Li Feifei, for example, has championed the idea of war models and using that as a next step to train any physical AI devices. And sort of war models obviously is a more straightforward way of teaching let's say a device to an autonomous device to understand its surrounding and to skip that that reliance on a language or on a transformer model, and sort of being able to go straight to action without sort of with native understanding of what it sees and what is perceived. I think that that process will eventually come. That is obviously to me as well, it's a pretty obvious next step for the industry. But until that technology becomes a lot more mature, we will probably still see a lot more VLA in the industry. And obviously, there are a lot of advancement coming out from many vendors out there. I mean, Edgybot, for example, has their own version of VLA that dramatically reduce sort of the compute intensity of the current VLA models, allowing it to respond to sensors faster, and that I think has still a pretty valid sort of let's say a value to robotics developer in general. And then I mean, fundamentally, I think this is where I will wrap up. I know this is going a bit technical. Most humanoid robots will have multiple models running on the robot itself. So there is never a case where if you look at, like, for example, an autonomous vehicle from Tesla, that vehicle will contain multiple AI models, so not just one. And that will be the future of humanoid robots as well, where you probably have multiple models, not just VLA, not just world models, but many other future models that's going to come. And all the previous model that we have, like machine learning, deep learning models, convolutional neural networks, all of them still have a reason to exist because they will be sort of responsible for various components and various action within the robot itself.
Right, because that future from now, it sounds a bit far away, but we've got a question from Neil from Loyola University, who wants to ask you about the development of humanoid robots as emotional companions. And so we know that there are many different functions that humanoid robots are for, and what is this roadmap for them being emotional companions?
Yeah, I think one of the earlier vision of a humanoid robot is to serve as this emotional companion for elderlies or for sort of people who are under hospital care. And there are obviously psychological benefits that is proven by scientific research that having a physical companion helps with better healing, better healthcare support, better healthcare system. And there are companies that's already produced robots for those type of use cases. I can think of a few top of my head. Embodied AI is one of them. But you argue that those robots are in a very primitive forms as compared to the humanoid robots that we have seen today. And they, even on the software side of things, they are rather limited to sort of very specific instructions and very limited natural language understanding. I think the advancement of both foundation models when it comes to conversational AI and the advancement in humanoid robotics does reignite the conversation of the value of emotional intelligence or emotional computing, as the industry sometimes like to call it, in providing sort of this companionship to the industry. I think we are still in a very early stage in terms of how would that look like. I will argue that if there is a domain to consider, that's probably is for companies that are really good in, let's say, on the software side of things rather than the hardware side of things, because a lot of the companionship, the value, the warmth, the sort of the human mimicking features is a lot more software oriented. So I will probably be banging a lot more on OpenAI or Google to resolve those challenges, to provide that value rather than the existing humanoid robotics vendors that seems to be a lot more focused on the hardware side of things. Not that they can't collaborate, and perhaps collaboration is the key moving forward. And then there is also the challenge of how do we want to design the robot itself. I think there is this can go on forever, but then there is obviously debate around whether do we deploy a robot that looks truly like human, but then trying to avoid the uncanny valley effect. So probably we'll, instead of doing a close to human type of mimicking will probably just deploy very cute-looking robots with big eyes and cute ears, and that's probably the other route to sort of provide that companionship. So I think sort of the industry still are trying to resolve those debates. There will be time where all this will get flushed out. Different vendors will come up with different solutions, and then we'll see in terms of how that kind of lands with the existing users.
All right, I guess before we see like a humanoid robot companion walking around in the house, many people are still just depending on whatever exists in AI, the AI world and the chatbots right now.
Yeah, most likely.
And so, yeah. The next question is from Larry from Pusatari Consulting. Larry wants to know if the humanoid discussion is just a problem about scaling. Is this a scaling issue? Or could there quite possibly be multiple winners in the robotic space with no clear dominant company?
I quite like the second view, the later view, where not just simply because scaling is a challenge, because, well, fundamentally, if we assume that the future tech world is still going to look very similar to what we are seeing right now, we can always sort of expect China to be the main powerhouse when it comes to robotics manufacturing, and then countries like South Korea to sort of take on the excess of the order and sort of produce robots that can be then shipped to other parts of the world. So I think that is less of an issue when it comes to where we put the production capability. I think what is more interesting at this point is fundamentally there will be a discussion in the future whether or not robotics technology falls under the broader sovereignty discussion. Are we going to see robots that is being deployed, let's say, in a specific country, needing to adhere to the sovereignty law that's being passed by that jurisdiction, requiring maybe not the entire robots, but definitely parts of the robots, and then perhaps the entirety of the data being generated by the robots and all the sort of the control of the robots to stay within that jurisdiction. And in that case, then we'll definitely be seeing fragmentation across the entire humanoid robotic space, which means in many markets, like let's say U.S., Germany, or Japan, that already have existing manufacturing capability, will probably shift some of the manufacturing capacity to produce robots, because they will then obviously expect their own the local enterprises to use locally produced robots and to have obviously all the data and all the AI functions being sort of focused within that country. And similarly, in other parts of the world, you'll probably see some sort of collaboration between the different vendors to sort of figure out, between the different economic markets, to kind of figure out how they should deploy the robots, but yet at the same time being able to enforce their sovereignty law on top of the very fragmented robotics industry. And I think that future is not that far away. I think there are valid reasons to believe that it's probably the next thing that the industry will consider once you start to see a lot more robots being adopted by the larger enterprise. And I think that probably points towards a future where, yes, there's probably no one winner takes all. In fact, you probably see sort of a local robotic champion that creates robots for the very specific domestic market.
All right. I'm sorry we're going a little bit over time and we have two more questions. I hope it's fine with everybody. Yeah, so I think you, Lian Jye, addressed some part of this next question we're seeing, which is, are there humanoid robots production in other countries other than China and the U.S. that are worth watching or have potential? You said Germany and Japan just now. Maybe can you elaborate on this question?
Yeah, so I think there are, again, two ways to look at it. The first way is to understand that the humanoid robots supply chain looks fairly similar to an EV supply chain at this point, because a lot of the companies that work on humanoid robots are actually either from the EV industry or sort of has learned a lot of their techniques from the EV industry. So which means companies that are already supplying to the EV industry will have an upper hand in terms of how they can serve or produce humanoid robots. So in many cases, that obviously applies to traditional powerhouses like Germany and Japan. And at the same time, I've also mentioned markets like South Korea, Taiwan, perhaps at some point Southeast Asia as well, where all these markets already have existing production capability when it comes to automotive manufacturing or heavy machinery manufacturing, that they can then be either repurposed or shifted to producing humanoid robots. And that transfer will not be as complex as you would imagine, because once the demand started to come in, I think that naturally people will see this as the sort of the next big thing and would gladly invest in their capacity into this technology.
All right. And the last question we have today is that as a researcher yourself studying this topic, what are you most looking forward to in 2026 when it comes to humanoid robots?
Yeah, there are many things that is worth looking forward to. I think we do want to see robots becoming a lot more, let's say, human mimicking in a way. I think last year, the industry, the one thing that excites the hardware people the most was that demo released by Xpan, where the robots is able to move almost at like almost 100% like human. And the one component that contributes to that movement was the human looking spine that goes into all these robots. Now that spinal structure is very customized, is being specially developed for that particular robot. And obviously at this point, really, really expensive because it's highly customized. But I think we will start to see more and more this sort of customized component being designed for human robots that didn't exist in any other hardware devices or equipments at the moment. And that will then start to drive another round of, let's say, improvement from a hardware standpoint. I think from a software standpoint, we're definitely going to see a lot more, let's say, power efficient chipset coming out. I mean, next week will be NVIDIA GTC. We'll start to hear a lot more from NVIDIA in terms of how they want to drive forward their physical AI innovation. I'm sure that involves some of more advanced chipsets that can be deployed as for inference workload on the robot itself. And that should drive let's say, the development of more complex AI models that can now be installed on device and reduces the latency and the sort of like the poor performances of the existing models. I think we will also start to see, interestingly enough, sort of I will argue perhaps discussion around how we change the workforce with the influx of all these robotics co-workers. I think we are already seeing a lot of this discussion on the AI front that's now going to get carried into the industrial manufacturing space. Once we start to have all these robots, we probably need to start to upgrade the existing workforce to either be able to work together with the robots or being the supervisors of all these robots. And that will, in the longer term, sort of reshape the existing workforce that we have, that we are currently used to, and perhaps change some of the discussion that we might want to sort of look at when it comes to future investment, future skill sets that we want to embed into all these robots. It might open up new use cases for these robots as well. So I think those are the stuff that I'll be looking forward to.
All right, thank you so much for pointing us to, what's to look for this year, and especially at Rest of the World, we're a tech publication, and we'll definitely be covering all these new developments in humanoid robots and in AI as well. So Lian Jye, thank you so much today for helping us cut through this hype and unpack what is really behind, these numbers, these industry visions. And also I want to thank everybody who attended the meeting, no matter which part of the world you're in. And you can reach out to me and Lian Jye on social media and to continue with the conversation. And we'd really appreciate it if you follow Rest of World on our social media platforms and on our coverage on Tech Stories. Thank you again, and we hope to see you at our next conversation. Good night and good morning if you're in US. Bye.